All right, welcome back to Master Photography, and today we're going to focus solely on shutter speed. Shutter speed controls both motion and light, but what we're going to be focusing on is motion. So if we shoot at a slow shutter speed, we can blur an image, and if we shoot at a fast shutter speed, we know we can stop action. So let's go ahead and move on. So this is the same slide that we had in our exposure triangle video. And we remember shutter speed is how long it takes for the shutter to open and close. So if it's open a long time, all right, that's going to allow for motion blur on our image. The longer it's open, depending on what the subject is, the longer the motion blur, unless you're shooting a non-moving object and using a tripod. So down here, we've got some examples of whole stops of shutter speeds. So bulb is as long as you press the button, it's going to stay open, then 30 seconds all the way up to 2000. However, most cameras are going to go to 4000. Some are going to 8000. All right. We've got some examples down here of what you should be using. So here we have blur or use tripod, and we're going to take a look at tripod. So this is a good speed for handheld images that are non-moving. And to stop action, you really want to be up at about 1,000th of a second or longer. So what we're going to take a look at today is both slow shutter speed examples and fast shutter speed examples. And so we're going to attack two different items in this motion, but we're also going to help learn equivalent exposures, because instead of just taking a picture of a whole bunch of things using a slow shutter speed, what I'm going to want you to do, and we'll see in the end, is kind of switch back and forth between slow and fast shutter speeds. So let's take a look at some slow shutter speed examples. And look, slow shutter speeds, depending on what you're doing, can be difficult to achieve. So if we look at this image, we've got this aspect of the image, which is perfectly sharp and still, and then we're getting that motion, right? And this is great in photography because it's a two-dimensional object, and sometimes it's difficult to show the aspect of time. What we've done here is we're either using a tripod or more likely handheld in this image, because if this is moving pretty fast, it's going to blur, and you're able to shoot around a 60th of a second to keep this still. And since this is moving fast comparative to 60th of a second shutter speed, that aspect of the image is going to blur. To do this, sometimes you're going to need a tripod. And one thing I can tell you is don't go on Amazon and buy the cheapest tripod for $25 that you can find, because it's not going to work. What's going to happen is you're going to put your camera up here, and as you're taking the picture, this thing is just going to slowly fall to one side. Manfrotto is a system that's been around for a long time. They're available at B&H in almost any camera store that you can find. And this is an example of a pan tilt head, a three-way pan tilt head. So this button here allows it to swivel this way. This is going to let it swivel up and down, and this is going to let it swivel at an angle. So tilt this way, tilt this way. And this little thing right here, this plate in this release mechanism is called a quick release plate. And they make smaller ones and bigger ones depending on what you want. So these are great. I still have my original, and this used to be called Bogan. So it was Manfrotto. Bogan was actually the name back in the day. Now it's just Manfrotto. But I still have two of them, and they work perfectly fine. And the one's 30 years old, and the other one's probably 25 years old. Over here, we have what's called a ball head. Now, some people like ball head, so you just loosen the tension and you can twist this. I'm not a huge fan of actually either one of these, but I really, in this case, not a big fan in general of ball heads. But if you have a friend with one and you can try it, that would be great. What I like is called a geared head, and you'll notice that the plate, this is larger and it's more expensive. And so it's kind of like this three-way pan tilt head, meaning that it does the exact same thing. This swivels around. This is going to let you go forward and backwards and tilt side to side. However, if you use this knob, it's like loosening this up and allows you a quick movement. But with this, sometimes, especially in macro photography, getting it in the right position is really difficult. So you can loosen this and get it in the general area. And then this knob on all these spins. And it's a geared knob, so it lets you make really refined movements so you can get your camera and your tripod exactly in the location that you want. So if you got some extra money and you want to buy a nicer head, this is great. Look, they also make video heads, but we're not going to be taking a look at video in this series. This is a great example of using that tripod. We set our tripod up. What's moving? Well, the water's moving, but the trees in the background aren't moving. So if we do a long exposure, we're getting that blur on the moving aspects of the image, which is the water. However, the objects that aren't moving are going to be sharp and still. Same thing here is a different way to look at this. And this is a smartly done photo because they're blending all the ambient lights really well. So we have a tripod. If you do a bridge, just be ready. They do shake and wiggle a little bit. So you can't do a super long exposure sometimes because you will get some blurred aspects of your photo just because of that bridge rocking back and forth. But basically, same thing. We're getting what we call light trails. And as the cars are moving this long exposure, we're getting blurred movement from both the vehicles and the lights. Here, we're just simply blurring our image. So this is a handheld image. We're shooting at a slow shutter speed, and we're using the blur to give us sort of this abstract look. Look, this is very difficult. You could take 100 photos and maybe only one or two of these work. So when you do this, the time that your shutter is open and how much you move is drastically going to affect the image. Here's another image where we're balancing the ambient light and the artificial light very well. And so what this person's doing is they have a rope or a cable and they have steel wool on the end, and you can light that stuff on fire and spin it around and it gives you this effect. This takes a lot of trial and error because the length of your exposure, how fast you spin it and how long you spin it for is all going to make up. So you kind of need to do it, keep track of what you're doing and do it over and over and over again until you get what you want. Next up are fast shutter speed examples. And so examples of this are stop action to freeze, fast motion, or just motion. It doesn't have to be fast motion and it doesn't have to be sports. So we can have a little dog. And one thing I want to just mention here is notice the low angle. So when you're photographing animals, getting at their eye level is great. Actually, getting at eye level or below for sports is great as well. We can tell we have a shallow depth of field. We've even got little bugs in the image that we're freezing. You can see a little gnat here and a little gnat here. And yeah, the dog is tack sharp. So we're shooting at an extremely fast shutter speed. I would guess this is 2000 or even faster. Another one here. If we look at these water droplets, they're like tiny little water droplets. If you were shooting at 1,000th of a second, these would be blurring more because they're moving much faster than you think they are. So this is another example of an extremely fast shutter speed. In our next example, this is just something simple, right? We've got a family on a beach and they're jumping in the air. If we want to stop that action, we need a faster shutter speed, right? Now, if you want to stop the action but have a little bit of a motion blur, so you have that element of time, maybe you shoot around a 500th of a second to get a little bit of that motion blur so it's not tack sharp. Horses running through the water, we can see the water droplets. We know, yes, this image, just like the other, is a extremely fast shutter speed. So I've got a guy running across some rocks here and he jumps in the air and we want to kind of stop that motion. We've got some really beautiful light. And so we're using that fast shutter speed to stop that action. So for my class and for anybody who wants to try this, I'm going to give you a shutter speed assignment. And what I want you to do is photograph a subject using slow and fast shutter speeds. And let's think about this. So we're going to have our subject moving and we're going to shoot at a slow shutter speed and they're going to blur. And then we're going to shoot at a fast shutter speed and stop the action. But what I want you to do is two things. I want you to learn how shutter speed works and get used to adjusting your camera. Take a few photos of a blurred image and then switch. So changing your shutter speed from maybe a 30th of a second all the way up to 2,000th of a second. And doing this, you're going to have to get an equivalent exposure. So we know that if we go from a 30th in whole stops to 2,000th of a second, that is 1/60th, 1/25, 1/250th, 1/500, 1/1000, and 1/2000th of a second. So that's a 6-stop difference. So we have to adjust on the camera to compensate for that lack of sunlight that's entering the camera. So that's going to be 6 stops darker. And to get the exposure to be the same as that slow shutter speed, we're going to need to add 6 stops of light. And so if you can't do that equivalent exposure quite yet, I'm going to show you or tell you an easier way to do that. Now it becomes a little bit more difficult, so we're just going to do a 2-stop adjustment just to make it easier. If we have a 2-stop difference, let's say we go from a 500th of a second to 2,000th of a second, that's 2 stops. Our shutter speeds on a camera adjust in third-stop increments. So each whole stop is actually 3 clicks on the camera. So if you go click, 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 and you can feel it on the dial when you do this, that's 1 stop. So if we need to go 2 stops, we want to move it so it's either opening or closing 6 clicks. So click, 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 click. That's 2 stops of adjustment, and that could be either way. You have to know which way you're turning it, whether you're letting more light or less light in. So if we adjust our shutter speed and we go 6 clicks from 500 to 2000, that's 2 stops less light. So we need to let in 2 stops more light somewhere else. So let's say we're going to do that on the aperture. So we want to open our aperture up so it lets more light in. That's a lower f-stop number, 6 clicks. So we go the opposite direction, go click, 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 click. That is an equivalent exposure without actually knowing what the numbers are, just using what we call clicks. This assignment can be difficult. And look, this assignment isn't about getting great photographs. It's learning how to use your camera. The first few assignments are about learning how to use your camera first. Then we can worry about taking great photos. So we want to constantly switch back and forth between these low and fast shutter speeds, both to try the examples and getting used to making equivalent adjustments. And so for my students, you're going to be taking 50 and 50. So 50 slow shutter speed and 50 high shutter speed images. This doesn't mean you have to shoot 50 completely different things. It can be the same thing the whole time. Don't care about that. Change your focal length, change the distance to the subject, change your angle to get different images. What we want you to do is experiment, especially on the low end, to see how a 60th of a second blurs versus 1 second blurs. Try different adjustments. Don't try the same thing. A lot of times people try to just get the exposure right and they shoot everything and they're done. Well, that's great, but you don't really learn as much as if you experiment and try different equivalent exposures. Well, that's it for this video on shutter speed. If you found this helpful and could give us a thumbs up, that would be great. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And don't forget to subscribe.